Hello family history writers, and welcome to this week's edition of Storylines. We all know we need description in our family history stories, but it's important to choose your description carefully, as it really should reflect your POV. So first, let's start by identifying what is a POV. POV is short for point of view. So when we write our creative nonfiction of family history, we craft it from the point of view of a protagonist ancestor. So the primary ancestor through whose eyes we will tell this story. So keeping that in mind, it's important when we add description to our stories that the description is through the perspective of that POV ancestor. We want to be really dialed in to what that ancestor would notice. And what they notice will be largely influenced by their circumstances. If it's not something that they would notice, then we either have to leave it out or come up with a way in which they would notice it. So consider what your ancestor would notice when they walked into a room. And what they notice, it's generally because it's something they care about, or maybe they would not notice it because they're not familiar with it. So for instance, if your ancestor was a farmer and he got up in the morning, his first thoughts might be to look out the window for the weather, because the weather is extremely important to a farmer. Now, if your ancestor is, let's say, a doctor, when he first got up in the morning, well, he might notice the weather. The weather might still be important to him, particularly if maybe he makes house calls. But maybe the weather wouldn't be as important to him. Instead, he might get up in the morning and he might be more concerned about hearing someone coughing in the house. Might be more in tune to something like that. You get the idea, right? So what makes up your ancestor? How does their personality, their background influence what they notice or ignore? And their history, their circumstances, the things that are important to them in their life are the things that they would notice, and therefore the things you should bring through in your description in a manner that would represent them in the story. We also want to choose description that is important to the overall story goal as well. Now, when we describe it, we should describe things when our protagonist notices them, not before and not long after. And then how we describe it? Well, we want to use voice. Now, voice is a fancy writer term for how the personality of an individual, their perspective, comes through in the words that they use in terms of their dialogue. When we're writing a description, we have to take into consideration the voice of the protagonist ancestor. So for example, how you describe the rain falling on a rooftop may be different if your ancestor is a military man or if he is a chef. So a military man might think of it sounding like rapid gunfire as the hail hits the roof, where a chef might think of it as a steak sizzling in a pan. Your ancestors' emotions also come into play here. They also should color the description in your story. In your story, if ancestor is noticing something, not only would we see a direct correlation to them and their history, but also how they feel about it. So how does your ancestors' knowledge as well affect description? Education, life experiences, they play a role in the words our character would use in their dialogue. So we shouldn't just be simply cataloging the world around our ancestor like a camera just panning around. We should be interpreting it through the unique lens of who our ancestor was. And that's how we are going to bring meaningful description into our story. Okay? I'll see you here next week for another edition of Storylines.